If you have your Bibles, we're going to be in the Gospel of Matthew this morning. It's Matthew chapter 6. And if you're familiar with this, you'll know that this is part of the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus is teaching and preaching his followers. So the Gospel of Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 through 24. And some of you who are very well versed in your Bible may be panicked because this is a passage where we have Jesus talking about treasures in heaven. And quite often, that leads up to our wallets. Rest assured, that's exactly where we're going today. The reason for this, and to our guests here today, I apologize. I preach on tithing once or twice a year. You have hit that Sunday. That Sunday where we talk about what we have, what we give, what we share, and how God uses that. Because quite honestly, one of the most spiritual things we can do is to trust God with everything that we have, including our checkbook. Now, some of you may smirk because you no longer have a checkbook. Debit account, savings account, whatever you call it, whatever you use to buy the things that you have and want and need, one of the best things we can do is to trust God with that. And we're actually continuing in our series, Single-Hearted, and I fully believe that it is impossible to be single-hearted, focused on God, if we are holding any area of our life back from God. And so as I was thinking about this, and you guys know that whenever we do kind of a tough, sermon, I love to open with a joke, and so I found a couple for you this morning. The first is a young mother trying to teach her younger daughter a lesson. And so she gave the daughter, they're on their way to church, and she said, "Honey, I have $1 for you and I have $0.25 for you, and I want you to put one of them into the offering plate." And so the daughter was 8 or 9 years old and really had a good concept of the value of money. And so she was sitting there, and the little girl was kind of struggling throughout the pastor's message, and she said she didn't know what she was going to do, and finally when the offering plate was passed, she had peace, and she smiled, and she placed the quarter into the plate. Now her mother was a little disappointed, a little discouraged, and she asked her, "Honey, why did you just put the quarter in instead of putting the $1 in?" She said, "Well, Mom, I wasn't sure. And I wrestled and prayed, and then I remembered the pastor said we should give with a joyful heart. And I was much more joyful to give the quarter and keep the $1." Not bad, right? Yeah. There's multiple stories about Henry Ford, but I think one of my favorites is that the very wealthy businessman had pledged to give $5,000 towards the construction of a new hospital that was desperately needed in an area. And the paper printed his donation, and there was a massive mistake. They added an extra zero. And it went from a $5,000 pledge to a $50,000 pledge. Mr. Ford was very upset. He was very concerned, and so he immediately got on the phone and contacted this newspaper to let them know what was going on. And the editor was a very brilliant person. They said, "Mr. Ford, no problem. Tomorrow morning, we will print a retraction that you've decided to take back $45,000 of your pledge." Mr. Ford thought about it for just a moment. And he said, "Okay, we will do the full $50,000 if you inscribe the words, 'I came among you and you took me in above the threshold.'" Money is a touchy subject. It's not something we like to talk about. In fact, at Cornerstone, we try to be very, very sensitive. It is the reason behind the fact that we went away from taking up a Sunday morning offering and mounted our boxes near the doors. Because we know that many people do not have much to give, and we don't want anyone to feel bad, to look down on, to feel judged, ashamed, or to feel like money gets in the way between you and God. And that is our heart, and so hear that. That is my heart. Because if money is keeping us from God, then there's a big problem with it. And we will do whatever we have to do to remove that barrier. But on the other hand, money sometimes is a different barrier to God. We say that we're only going to give a little bit, or we're not going to give very much to God because we're not sure that God will provide. I have to be honest with you, my spiritual financial journey began when I really became a pastor. I was much like the young girl prior to that, especially as a college student, because college students don't have any money. College graduate, perhaps not a lot of money. And it's easy to fall into that. And so I was much like the young girl. I would put the quarter in, or many weeks put nothing in because, hey, I'm not really working. And the day I began to pastor my first church, I realized that maybe there's a problem. If I'm going to tell people that they can trust God with their money, then I better be willing to do it too. Sometimes that's a really tough statement to make. It's a really tough place to be, and I challenge our leadership team members to be tithers and supporters. Because if you're going to be making decisions with other people's money, you need to be giving. And Jesus comes at it from a totally different perspective. And Jesus hits the method that I think we so often try to emulate at Cornerstone. Jesus hits money as a hard issue. And I share this because over the years I've been asked so many questions about tithing. Well, is it 10% off the net or 10% off the gross? Wrong question. I don't worry that much about it. Well, what if I can't do 10%? Well, what can you do? Well, I could do 3 or 4. Then shoot for that. And then I've had other people along years that I've learned that they said, well, we give 10% and it's not a big issue. And we'll talk about it becoming a matter of the heart for them and challenging them to go beyond this. We want this to be a nice, simple, basic number. Here's the equation, fill in the blank. We don't ever have to think about it. And that has never been the way God operates. And as Jesus approaches this topic in the Sermon on the Mount, he goes right for the heart issue. He talks about treasure in heaven, and I want to read our scripture passage this morning. It's Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 through 24. And what we hear Jesus saying, store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moth and rust do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are good, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness? No one can serve 2 masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. Jesus is basically asking this question, this heart question, what do you treasure the most? What is the most important thing to you? One of the things that I'm just amazed at with humanity is that across time, across the planet, we have this desire to collect things. Outside of a few tribes that I know who are really nomadic and they don't carry much, they only take with them what they can carry on their back. We have this innate desire to collect things. As a child, my siblings and I spent a great deal of time out riding our bikes. And we got bored just riding around the property. And so we went to this small section of woods and we cleared trails and we made them roads. We had a traffic cop, somebody who wrote citations. We had a banker. And then we had my brother. And I had a blast pulling him over. My sister had a great time, lending or giving him money. And for currency, as the banker, we used leaves. It worked really well. They were green. They were about the right size. They deteriorated. And we didn't really trust the bank, so we would do something ingenious. We would hide our leaves under the rock. I did it a number of times. I had a particular rock where I would hide my leaves. And once or twice, I'm quite ashamed to admit, but I forgot which rock I had chosen. But even in this small cross-section, this small environment where it's just the three of us playing and having fun, we wanted to see who would get the most. And it's this trait in humanity. We like to collect things, and then we assign a value to the things that have been collected. It doesn't matter what it is. And I've heard stories of missionaries coming back saying that they encountered women in different countries with dirt floors who argued over who had the cleanest dirt floor. It doesn't matter our society. It doesn't matter what it is. We always want to know who comes out on top. Where do I fit? Where do I rank? Where do I compete? And we use a lot of different things to get there. Money is one of them. Treasure is one of them. And I want you to think about this for a moment, the different kind of collections that we have. Some people collect artwork. I happen to collect artwork. Most of my artwork is done by a 5-year-old. Some of it is done by a 3-year-old. And it is priceless to me. But there are other people who collect artwork with artists by the name of Monet and Picasso and Van Gogh and Andy Warhol and Salvador Dali and Michelangelo. And those paintings seem to have a much higher price tag than the work done by my daughter. Another example of things that we like to collect through, or the things that we like to collect, are cars. Now this is one, I've been to the art museum. I appreciate great art. I don't understand most of it. But what I do appreciate and understand are cars. And I've had the opportunity to walk through massive collections of cars. Classic cars, I might add. Beautiful cars. Worth millions of dollars. Some of them I had the opportunity to see at the Detroit Auto Show. Really cool. Some of these collections of cars were in a junkyard. 2 collections of cars. Both classic cars, very different values, right? And our collections, depending upon who says they're desirable or not, get a certain amount of value, a certain amount of interest. And so Jesus is asking this question, what do you value, what do you treasure in a time when fabric was treasured, spices were treasured, livestock was treasured, children were, the number of children was treasured? And he's talking about what do you value? What is your treasure? And there is treasure in each one of these things. We assume that the treasure is the same for everyone, but it's really not. Because I know people who have lots of livestock and they value that. I know people who have lots of cars and they value that. I know people who have beautiful paintings and they value that. I know people who have beautiful guitars and they value that. Jesus asks a very simple question. What do you treasure? What is it that's in your heart that you absolutely love? Because if you can't answer that question, you're really going to struggle with what are you storing up? For me, I told you I like cars. I like guitars. Every now and then I get onto Martin's website and I drool at some of the beautiful guitars on there. And I think, man, those must sound awesome. And there's a little bit of envy there. Sometimes a little more than a little bit. But isn't it what we do as people? When we find something that we value, when we find something that we treasure, we want to get more and more and more of it. And Jesus begins to issue this warning that there are all of these things that we treasure on earth, and every one of them fades away. Guitars, if they're not properly maintained with the right humidity level, will crack. They never sound the same. Clothes go out of style. They wear out or no longer fit, depending upon how you may grow. and they're no longer valuable, right? Every car out there fights a battle with rust and wearing out. Livestock, you fight a battle for disease. Artwork has to be preserved. All of these things that we value, and they're good, wonderful things, but they're all fighting a day when they'll no longer be good, when they'll no longer be useful, when they'll no longer be what they once were. And so Jesus is talking to them saying, I don't care what your treasure is. Do you understand that if you invest in all of this stuff, it will eventually disappear? The rust, the moth, it will eventually be gone. I don't really like that. I don't really like that statement because the stuff that I love, I want to have it forever. In fact, I get attached to some of my shirts. So much so that Jen has learned she doesn't ask me when she should get rid of it. They just start missing. Because I have worn them and loved them too well. And there are holes. Or they no longer look good. Because I'm not the size that I was in college. All of these things that we put value and money and time into and effort into will eventually disappear. And so Jesus asked this first question, what do you treasure? But the real question underneath it is, where do you find your worth? Where do you find your worth? Is it in having a nice car? There is nothing wrong with having nice cars. There's absolutely nothing wrong with having nice guitars. There is nothing wrong with having artwork. But when that becomes our defining feature, when that becomes where all of our value comes from, there is a problem. And as I struggled a lot with low self-esteem as a high school student and college student, I wanted a cool car because I was sure that if I had a cool car, everyone else would think better of me. And so, as soon as I got out and I had the money to buy one, I bought the coolest car I could. You may not have thought it was cool. I thought it was cool. And up here, it was amazing. It's this question of, where do you find your worth? What defines who you are? And so then this question of, where do you store your treasure? Is it in stuff that will eventually wear out, rust out, be worn out, no longer work? Or is it in something that is much different? Every car I've ever owned has worn out. And as sad as I am, the truck I have now will eventually wear out. It kills me that I can look underneath the paint and see where rust is starting. And just for the record, what's the worst dent in a new vehicle? First one. The first one. And I remember the first dent in my current truck. I have no idea where the other ones came from. These are the things that we look at and we struggle with when we try to determine our worth. And so Jesus is really asking a spiritual question. If Jesus is able to catch a fish and pull money for tax out of it, do you think he's really worried about the money aspect? No. The scriptures tell us that happened. The disciples out to catch a fish, and when they caught the fish, they pulled a coin out of its mouth to pay the tax. This is not about the amount of money that is given. This is about the spiritual condition in our heart. And so Jesus is talking to people about finding their worth, because if they're always looking for it in stuff, if we're always looking for it in stuff, we will miss the worth as God's child. Does that make sense? It's a caution from Jesus to be careful working for things that make you feel better about yourself, but ultimately won't last. And he's warning his listeners to be careful about things that they use to define who they are. Because when your treasure is destroyed, when your treasure is stolen, when your treasure is rusted, when your treasure is diseased, when your treasure is rusty, when your treasure has holes in it, what does that do to your self-worth? You end up feeling the same way. And if you don't believe this is true, look at the panic that happened when the stock market crashed a few years ago. No, I'm not a big fan of throwing money away. But look at the panic. Because everything that we thought we had was on the verge of disappearing. And so Jesus is telling his followers and telling his disciples, and I believe the message being passed to us today is that our worth is more than just what we have or what we don't have. And no matter how cool we think we will be by having the best car out there, it'll pass. So Jesus goes on, he takes this a step further. He says, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And this is the part of single-hearted. If we are talking about being all in with God, letting God absolutely own our heart, take up residence there where nothing else is in, then we have to evict the things that try to take his place. And I will tell you that loving God is more important than anything else we can have. Loving God is more important than any trip we can take, any clothes we could have, any guitar we could buy, any car we might dream of owning. And yet, as people, we often prefer those things, myself included. And so Jesus gives us a warning, but it's also an investment strategy. This is that two sides of the same coin again. It's a warning to be careful about where you spend and invest and use to define yourself, and it is an opportunity to invest in something that will never be destroyed, to never rust out, guaranteed to always start, guaranteed to never need new strings, guaranteed to be understood by anyone who is willing to listen. And so Jesus talks about where you invest and building up a treasure that will never be lost or never destroyed, never stolen. And so Jesus is absolutely talking about the things that we use to buy or trade for the things that we value. Meaning our money, our time, our talents, our relationships. In the church world, we call these things stewardship. That's how we use them appropriately. Managing all that God has blessed us with. And the goal is to be good stewards of what God has given us. The past couple months, I've gotten quite comfortable with my guitar playing skills. I know that they have room to improve, but I've hit a level where I'm pretty happy. You know what that means? I've stopped investing in practicing. Because I know that most of the time I can play what I want to play. And yet on Sundays, the past few weeks, I've been paying a price for it because my fingers hurt. Now those of you who may not be familiar with that, when you play often, your fingers build up calluses that help you play better. They help you not feel the pain, but they also help you actually get a better tone out of it. And I've said, you know what? God, we can do this. We're good. We can handle it. And so instead of investing my talents in something for God, I've kind of been taking it easy. It's not the best thing. We talk about cars often because when I think of treasures, those are things that I really like cars. I always have. And those of you who know me well are pretty well aware of this. In fact, the first car that I ever dreamed of having was my grandparents' 76 Pontiac Ventura. Anybody familiar with that? Very similar to a Nova, but not quite. It was a Pontiac. And here's the deal. I grew up looking at this car, and I had amazing dreams of what this car could become. And so, when I turned 17, I worked out a deal with my grandmother, because she had never driven. She had never had her license, and the car had sat in the garage since my grandfather passed almost 10 years prior to that. And I was watching this car sitting there and rust away. And I had this picture of what it could be. And I learned real fast that nothing comes to be without a great deal of effort. And so my dad had done some body work in his younger years, and he said, well, if you work at sanding it, I will help you do the patchwork that you need to do, and I'll help you paint it. I had never sanded a car in my life. I had never done patchwork in my life. And I had painted, but with a brush, and you could tell that I had done it. It looked rather rough. And so I went out, and I figured it wouldn't be that bad. It wouldn't take that long. And so I went out to the garage, and I began to sand. And Dad showed me, he's like, you take your sandpaper, you put it in the water, and you wet sand. It didn't take very long until I realized there were two things being sanded. The car and my fingers. And it really hurt. But I was committed to doing this. And so I went to Dad, I said, there's got to be an easier way. Isn't there a power tool we can use? What about some air tools? He said, no. He said, this is the way it's done. And so I sanded for a good 30, 40 minutes that day. And I thought, I'll do it tomorrow. Came back the next day and sanded until my fingers hurt. That was about 5 minutes. And I put the bucket and everything away. Thought, you know what? I'll give my fingers a couple days to heal and I'll come back. Came back a week later. Got a good 10 minutes of sanding, but here's what I started to learn. The part that I had stripped down in my whole 45 minutes of sanding was now rusting. Could not believe it. Had no idea that something I could work on could disappear that quickly. If only we could see our other investments that clearly. And so Jesus challenges everyone here to use all that they have to build up a treasure that won't rust. A treasure that won't be destroyed, a treasure that won't disappear. And that really does mean our money. It means our time, it means the talents that we have, and it means our relationships. It means a longevity perspective, where we look at this as not what I can do in 5 minutes to just feel better and not think about it. It means the way that I live on a day in and day out basis. You might even say that this is about being deep and wide, using what God has given us to invest in the kingdom. I don't enjoy talking about this stuff. I would much rather help explain some of the other scriptures to you and to help you understand how much God loves you, to help you understand that Christ died for your sins and that there is eternal life for you if you're willing to trust Him. But the reality is that for those of us who believe in God, one of the most spiritual things we can do is to trust God with our resources. And it's not just that we trust God to provide for us so that we have access to give. It's that we give and trust God to provide them, to meet our needs. I'm not a fan of prosperity gospel or in health and wealth preaching, and I try so hard to avoid that. And so I preface the next illustration with that. But when I was at my previous church, I was on staff, and there was something that I really wanted to see happen in the church, and the only way that that could happen is if we cut expenses, and the only thing that was left to cut was actually my salary. Now, we had been doing okay, but I really wanted to get to this certain level, and I said, okay, this is the cut that we'll make. Jen and I talked about it. We prayed about it. We were really on the same page. And I went to the leadership team and I said, okay, here is the cut that I am going to take to help make this come about for the church, because I believe that in the long term it will really benefit the church. We went on through, we passed the budget and began taking that new salary at a different rate. Jen's grandmother had died about 2 years prior to that. And as her parents had worked through and settling all of the estate, they came across an old savings account that they had no idea was even there. The savings account ended up matching the cut that I took at the church. That's one tangible example. And please hear my heart. This is not give $1, expect God to give you 10. This is trusting God where God is leading with all that you have. There's a huge difference. And I don't enjoy talking about it because so often in our society, finances are private. We don't want to talk about it. We don't want other people to know where we are. We don't want to be accountable. We don't even really want to deal with it, especially if things aren't great. But I'm telling you that real growth occurs when we say to God, okay, all that I have is yours. I am setting this aside for you. And God, no matter what happens, I believe that you'll take care of me. That's one example. I wish that every time I wrote a check for God, I got the same thing back. That's not it. But I can tell you, I don't regret any of the investments that I've made in God's kingdom. I do regret some of the treasures and purposes I've made just to make me feel better. Do you see the difference? And so, here's the deal. The scriptures talk about giving a tenth. A tithe is actually a tenth. But what we see Jesus doing throughout the scriptures is all about sacrificial giving. We give everything that we have. So God doesn't want a tenth of your time. He wants all of your time. God doesn't want a tenth of your talent. He wants all of your talent. God doesn't want a tenth of your relationship. He wants all of your relationship. And God doesn't want just a tenth of your money. He wants all of it. It all belongs to Him. So what do we do with that? It's sacrificial giving. Meaning, if you are giving nothing right now, then it's time to start. And I know, because there have been times in my life where I felt like I didn't have $1 to give. $1 was a sacrifice. And what we read about the widow giving her 2 coins, 2 pennies, and she gave more than everyone else. It's not the amount, it's the heart. And so if you've been sitting in your life and you've been given a tenth and you don't even miss it, guess what, friend? It's not sacrificial giving. It takes us beyond what we think we could do. So single-hearted. It means not only do I trust God with my eternity, I trust God with my earthly experience. We're going to close this morning. And true to Cornerstone's fashion, we're not taking up an offering after this. The boxes are mounted near the door. I meant what I said. This is a matter of the heart. And if you feel God moving, we're not going to put it in front of you. It's your job to take it to where it goes in. We're not going to make anyone feel bad for what they can or cannot do. But we are going to trust God to supply our needs each and every day. And so if you've never had that conversation, it's time to have it. Let's close in prayer today. God, thank you that you love us. Not based on what we have done for you, but because, God, you see us as valuable. God, thank you that we can trust you with everything that we have, not because we always plan and get it right, but because you are good and you care about us. God, I pray for each person who is here, and I know what it means to trust you with our checkbook, and I know how scary that is at times, but God, you have never let us down. And you tell us throughout your word, and you've shown us time and time again, that God, you are faithful. Whether it is delivering manna to the Israelites in Egypt, or delivering or renewing the flour and the oil in the jar for the widow, or caring for even the ravens. God, we know that we could trust you, and we thank you. And God, I pray for each person here that, God, that the treasure that is built up for us as a church would not be about stuff and things to make us look and feel good, but it would be about a treasure in heaven which can never be destroyed, never be taken, never lose its value. God, may we find our worth in you today and all the days of our life.